in the interest of time, and because we've had some, I think, very interesting presentations, I can actually not say some of the things I might otherwise have said, but we'll focus on a few areas. And first of all, the purpose of this exercise was to look at implementation and follow-up. And I think it might be helpful to actually think about what we're meaning by implementation and follow-up. As I understand it, implementation is the actual action, and it requires the state or government to do. Follow-up is a means towards the objective of implementation, and is primarily therefore done by others, although obviously parts of the government may also be involved in follow-up in order to ensure implementation. So I'd like first of all to focus a little bit on the question of implementation. One of the things that we were able to learn from the experience of treaty body reporting processes and take into the UPR was the question of having broad national consultations beforehand. And I think that's been very important and very valuable. But one element of that, I think, has been forgotten, because the original intention was that these would not only be consultations amongst or between government and civil society, amongst civil society or between civil society and government. The intention was that it would also be a process of broad consultation amongst different parts of the government and different levels of the government, in particular if it's a federal state or something. Because, as we keep hearing, one of the impediments to implementation is you have to have the right part of the government engaged in the process. And if you engage with them in the process from the beginning, rather than having a process in which they are not involved, and then coming back after the Geneva bit, shall we call it, of the process, and saying, right, now we want to do this and this and this, one, they probably know nothing about it, as we heard, in terms of a follow-up visit to a country after a treaty body examination. And secondly, they may well say, well, those aren't really our priorities, you know, you, the foreign ministry, or you, whoever it was, can go off and talk about these things in international fora, but our concern here is our budget is about to be cut in half because there's a financial crisis, why should we bother about this? So I think it could be really valuable to re-examine that element in terms of how do you actually get the engagement of government in its broadest sense at the beginning of the process. That then brings us to the follow-up, as it were, in terms of implementation. And again, I really want to focus on this at the national level, because this is what we're actually trying to do something about. So I think we should try and actually institute a practice, and perhaps even through the Human Rights Council review, we could reflect this, of what we might call a reverse broad national consultation after the review in the Human Rights Council. And the purpose of that then is to re-engage the national actors, the National Human Rights Institution, the NGO, civil society, and the various government departments and levels of government in the planning for the implementation. And I think this French model is a very interesting one. Because, in fact, if you think about it completely logically, and particularly if you have a large number of recommendations, and we're seeing that most countries now who go through the UPR will have a large number of recommendations. What are you going to do with those? How on earth are you going to actually implement these recommendations, the ones you've accepted? Let's not worry for the moment about the question of what was and wasn't accepted, and why, and so on, although I think there are a whole range of issues about that. And I think this is where, logically, it really makes sense to develop a plan of action. A plan that says, okay, here are the recommendations. As we get more and more, and we have seen that many of those are actually about the same issues. They may be slightly different in wording, but you know, of the 200 or whatever it is that the representative of the United States, quite a significant number were on a relatively limited number of issues, such as the death penalty. So clearly, if you're looking at implementation in a logical way, you need to bring those together. So you will not end up with 200 recommendations, in fact, once you've actually done that. Then you need to think about what does the recommendation require us to do? And if we just stay with that example, supposing, best case scenario, the United States said, yes, we accept the recommendations that we should abolish the death penalty completely. What is that actually require the state to do? Which, if you're thinking about it, that's what the state needs to figure out. And clearly, again, some of that will be different parts of the government may be involved. It may be that it is a government action that can be done. It may be that it has to go through some kind of a legislative process. It may be that it has to go through different kinds of things. And unless you start actually spelling out what those steps are, then how are you going to go about doing it? And also then, when we come to the monitoring, how can you monitor, is the state actually doing anything about this recommendation that it accepted? Or is it just saying, yes, we accepted it, sometime maybe we might get around to doing something towards it? But equally, there may be factors that even the most genuine government willing to actually implement a recommendation, it is not in its power to do. And a very obvious one again is something that requires legislative change. The government can propose the legislation to its legislative body, but the legislative body may choose not to actually take that up, or it may take it up and not for several years, or some such. So even at a fairly simple level, if you start looking at it, you realise that it makes sense to develop this. So what is it required to do? How do they propose to do it? What's the timeline? Who is responsible for doing it? And this is again where you come back to, you really need that buy-in from different government ministries, the federal or the state level, or the provincial level, depending on, or the LIMDA, depending on how you actually define your different institutions. Once you've developed that, then I think we can start looking at the question of follow-up more sensibly. Because that is what then brings us to who follows up and how. And some of that, again, is at the national level. And I'm not going to elaborate more on that because I think we've had a very good example. At the international level, you could also look at the regional, but let's skip that for time reasons. At the international level, we have the UPR itself. So yes, we are planning some kind of a second round of the UPR. Clearly, follow-up needs to be part of that consideration. And the better kind of action plan that we have, with what I was talking about, the easier it will be to see for the government and for those other governments and anyone else who's involved. Has the government actually developed that kind of plan? Has it actually started implementing any of those things? What are the steps it has taken? If it hasn't taken some of those steps, why hasn't it taken them? How is it going against its timelines? And you could also put in then another column that says, we need help. We need help because we want to do something about reforming the way the police do crowd control. Can someone help us with this? We need help because, and some of those may have financial implications, some of them may not necessarily have financial implications. So again, I think if we can look at it in that way, you can also start identifying, in a real sense, what does the government perceive as the needs of assistance and the different kinds. And then against that, you have the question of who could actually provide that. Can it be done bilaterally? Can it be done through organizations like the Commonwealth? Could it be done by OHCHR or another part of the UN? Sensibly, what's the best mechanism for doing this? And you can also look at implementation in that sense then. Is the assistance that is required actually being provided. UPR second round. We have the Human Rights Council's Agenda Item 6. We've had some good examples of states who have, on a voluntary basis, already started presenting these, some of them, these kinds of action plans, if you like, and reporting against them. That obviously could be developed. It needn't be additional work in the sense that if you're starting to do things and you've got your plan, when you come to round 2, you've already got some of that work done. So it's actually a step in the right direction. But I think it was a useful reminder that we had this morning that the systems actually are designed, maybe designed is too clear a word, but can certainly provide an opportunity for follow-up in other ways. Already in round 1 of the UPR, we have this report from the office which includes the recommendations from the special procedures and the treaty bodies. And some of those have been taken up in the recommendations. Equally, therefore, the special procedures and the treaty bodies should have a vested interest in looking what has happened in relation to those and following up. And we have, in fact, ourselves seen that process in some instances where a concluding observation from the treaty body formed the basis for a recommendation in the UPR and was then taken back to the treaty body because the sequencing happened to work in that case. And one of the values in relation to the UPR is precisely this point that the state has to respond to the recommendations. So in this particular instance, the state did not make any response at all, as far as I'm aware, to the treaty body in relation to the concluding observation. When it came to the UPR, in fact, it rejected it, but also gave reasons why it rejected it, which was useful. Because actually, when you know why the state is rejecting it, the treaty body is then in a better position to follow up, because it can then enter into a discussion with the state. You rejected this on these grounds. Do we consider this valid? What kind of grounds, etc., etc. So you can see it in that way. Finally, I would just like to remind people of the nature of the UPR. One of the things about it, there's all sorts of things about it. One of the things about it that is very different from the treaty bodies is its visibility. And its visibility, and that's in one sense in a literal physical sense because it's webcast, but it's also because it is a political process. And it's much more embarrassing for a state to fail to appear in front of its peers with all the political pressure. Yes, it's also new, and yes, there's been much more engagement by the High Commissioner's Office in helping states to get there, so that forms part. I think there is also this element. And because of its political nature in that sense. And that again means that it has a value in helping to follow up on the recommendations and the concluding observations. But I think there's also, in the various very useful analyses of the recommendations, including ones by UPR Info, I think there's one classification that we tend to overlook, and that is there's a valuable set of recommendations that actually brings the state into the system. So that is, yes, ratifications of treaties, but it's also the pressure to submit overdue reports. And our brief quantitative analysis is that indeed there has been increased reporting, increased ratifications of treaties, increased withdrawal of reservations, as well as what we've heard in relation to the special procedures, the numbers of standing invitations and so on. And I think those have a particular value because they are actually a way of bringing states more into the more regular monitoring processes and reinforcing them in that way. Thank you very much.